What's up? How y'all doing? It's Jared. This is a 133 fixed blade infidel from Benchmade, new for 2018. And I was walking through the store, they had the 417 Fact in there, and that knife I've been stoked about. I really want to get my hands on a 417. It's fun playing with it for a little bit. I want to stick it in my boot. I think it's going to make an excellent boot knife. I saw this thing in the shelf. It is number 2 out of 700. Number 2 out of 700 first production run. That's actually the lowest first production run number I've ever seen in the wild on video or in person, anything. So I had to pick this thing up. I was like, are you freaking kidding me? That's number 2. I had intended on picking this knife up. I was going to get the satin bladed version, but this isn't something I'm ever going to use or actually carry. This is more of a collector's piece for me. If I ever get into, like a shit hits the fan scenario, SHTF, something like that, this is definitely going to be one of the knives that I stick on my boot because I really do like it. But it's a very purposeful design. You can see they actually only did a run of 700 on the first production run too, which makes that number 2 just a little bit more special on that. The dagger is executed very well, but the first thing I want to say about this thing I really like, if you're familiar with old school knives, right? 1820s, 1850s, 1870s, in there, the coffin-handled dagger, the coffin-handled Bowie knife, coffin-handled knives were very popular. There was a lot of them. They were very ornate. This is kind of updated, it's been changed from the original coffin handle shape, but it's still reminiscent of that, right? And people used to carry those around as legitimate self-defense items. I mean, well, I say legitimate in the facts of they were much more likely to actually be using their knife for self-defense than we are today. This knife here is probably, relatively not on that line for civilians because this is really kind of a dedicated knife design. This is probably going to be more focused towards law enforcement, police, things like that. There's going to be a lot of people carrying these around, and it's an excellent knife for that. But it harkens back to something old school. It's got a classic vibe to it. The fact that this is a fixed blade dagger with a coffin handle really takes me away from the fact that of the infidel. The actual OTF infidel, which I don't actually have one here to do a comparison. If you're not familiar with that, it's an out the front infidel. It's much like this Microtech Ultratech right here that I've got in my boot. Kind of the same thing, different shaped handle, it's different, but it's an OTF knife, right? And that's actually what this thing is. This is just a fixed blade version of that. They did change it up. The blade is a lot wider. The stock thickness on this thing, they advertise as a .144 inch. And I'm pretty sure that is the stock here, 1.144 inches. Because if you actually look at the way this blade is ground, because of this, the way that it's a dagger, right? It's ground on both sides here. It's got a V grind on both sides of this blade, and so it actually tapers down right at the start, right at that plunge grind right there. It actually does shrink down to make a more narrow blade, which is good for what this thing is intended to do. This is a stabby, this thing is designed to penetrate material and do it really well with not a whole lot of resistance, and for that it's going to do a really good job. I think you can actually see the way that this fuller tapers off here, and that is tapering off to actually come down and form this tip. That's where it actually starts to taper down, is where that fuller starts, and you can see it's almost all the way out. It carries the breadth of the knife, the breadth of the actual blade, the stock thickness, all the way out until about this point here. And so even though it is thinner, even though it is that dagger grind, it's still a decently reinforced blade. It's got a lot of strength in it, especially since the fact that it's D2, which is a really strong steel. I think that's why Benchmade keeps it in their lineup. I know that's why they make a lot of their ballet songs out of it, because they just intend it to take a beating. And this thing here is good for that because it does have such a narrow tip. It's not extremely narrow. Compared to a lot of other daggers, I don't know if I can get this to come across here, you can see that it is chisel ground. It's only got an actual edge bevel right there on one side, which they didn't do perfectly. They did knock off a little bit more of the burr in certain areas to take off the actual, to create that cutting edge. They rounded off this side, not rounded it off, but sanded it down just a little bit more. It's not absolutely perfect. You can see a little bit of silver here, and you can't see any silver on the bottom there, but that's just regardless, because the actual grind of this knife is very impressive. If you're familiar with daggers, if you see a lot of dagger blades, a lot of them aren't lined up perfectly well. There's a lot of daggers out there. I've seen a lot of them to where this actual center ridge here just doesn't meet up with the tip. Hold on, actually, let me go grab something. This is what I'm talking about here. If you saw my review on this thing that I just did a little while ago, you can see where that center line actually meets up to the tip. It's just a horrible job. That's not symmetrical at all. It's not really well done. You can pull up a little bit higher end knife here. This is a ProTech tentilla is what it is. And you can see that that center ridge there still doesn't meet up with the tip. I mean, this side does. That side's, it's off a fraction of an inch. You can see that right there where it meets up with that front cutting bevel, it's just off a tiny bit. This side's kind of embarrassingly off, especially for a company like ProTech. It's a really, you know, it's a higher end knife. The fact that it's doesn't have the best grind on it is, it's not the best thing in the world, but I mean, it's going to do the job. It's going to do it pretty well. And this thing here is actually damn near perfect. This is one of the best factory grind daggers. You can see that that center ridge there follows the fuller and actually comes all the way up to the tip. It's the same thing on this side here. Comes all the way up and meets that tip basically perfectly, which actually gives more structural rigidity to the tip of the knife because that center ridge is actually working as reinforcement. It's more steel coming out towards the end of this tip. And so even with as thin as it is with that chisel grind, there's more meat up there. There's more steel right up there at that tip. Even though it is so thin, it's going to be a really excellent penetrator. It's going to stab into material really well. So it's definitely a nice grind. I like the way that this blade has been done, the way that it's been actually ground out, the way that it's been executed. I like the fact that they made it a little bit wider. The weight on this thing is, 5.11 ounces. And so it's not the lightest knife, but you can see the balance point is way in the back. Balance point's all the way back here because you got that whole stock thickness carrying all the way through with these aluminum handles. So there's a lot of material, there's a lot of metal in the back, and the balance point is it's all the way back there. And so when I actually give it a grip, give it a good grip like this, it's very light. It's very maneuverable feeling. There's almost no weight coming out of the front end of this knife, which makes it very fast feeling in hand. And I definitely like that. The handle itself doesn't have the most stoppage protection from actually sliding up onto the blade. You can see that there's a little bit of a swell here and this traction pattern, which is nice because it is actually running in both directions. And with a knife like this, what this is intended for is in, out, in, out, in, out. And so it actually gives you the texture in both directions. You've got traction pulling out and you've got traction pushing in. As gruesome of a thought as that is, but it works. It's actually done really well, and it's got kind of a cool aesthetic view as well. It does work well with gloves on. You can see the way that these scales are actually set up. The screws actually just through mount. They go through the tang of the blade and actually mount into this scale here. It's what's holding it all together. And I like the aesthetics of that because it only gives two screws on one side. It's the side that actually says first production run. I'm probably going to wind up mounting this thing, sticking it on my wall somewhere, but you can see the actual little bit of deformation right there on this aluminum, the actual anodized aluminum there, hard coat anodized aluminum, whatever it is. I'm not sure what the black coating is on here. I think they advertise it as DLC, but it's not a very shiny, it's not a very thick DLC, and you can definitely still see all of the grind lines, all of those factory grind lines underneath the actual coating of the blade, underneath that black coating, which I like. That's an aesthetic appeal for me because it shows you the grinding. You can actually see the material, or the actual process. This was done on a CNC machine, and you can see just the accuracy of those actual grinds in that pattern underneath the steel. But for a larger aesthetic purpose, that's really not a good thing. But this is not an aesthetic knife. This is not a knife that was designed to look pretty. This is a knife that's designed to do some dirty work, and I really think it's going to be good at that. The sheath, I really do like. The sheath is done pretty well. There's one big gripe that I actually do have about this sheath. I'll get into that in a minute. I like the belt clip. You can see it comes around. It's actually got that little loop on there, and it's got a decent amount of retention. So you can actually hook this onto your belt. It's not going to go anywhere, and it won't actually come up, but you do have the option of putting it on your belt or removing it with actually taking your belt off, which is definitely a nice thing. A bunch of holes all over in it. I imagine this is bolt-on material here. I don't think it's actually Kydex, so it's definitely MOLLE compatible. You can strap everything up on there. The retention on this thing is interesting, right? Because when I slide it in, when I actually put this knife into the sheath, you can see that there's no positive engagement. It just kind of slides in there. It just kind of pop, pop, pop. And the reason for that is what's actually giving you the retention here is these two little lumps sliding over the edges here of this handle. And you can see the way that that's shaped. It's a very gradual transition here with a more heavy transition, more heavy swoop on the back, right? And so when I put it in, it's rolling over that first little lump when I actually stick it into the sheath. And so it doesn't have a positive click. There's no positive engagement. But actually pulling it out of the sheath, you can see this, because it's that heavier transition there, it does have a pop. There's a very positive pull on the exiting the sheath, but actually when you're putting it into the sheath, it doesn't have a very positive click, but it's definitely a good retention. It's not going to go anywhere. I do have confidence in it. It's not something that I would carry upside down, but again, this is never a knife that I'm going to strap around my neck, something like that. The biggest hit that I can give this sheath with isn't necessarily a hit. If you're familiar with the 119 Arvenzas right here, right? They came out with this thing in 2016, 119 Arvenzas from Benchmade. This is one of my favorite just overall knives. I freaking love this thing. It's excellent. But the sheath here, the way that this is done, very reminiscent. You can definitely see that Benchmade styling in the way that these sheaths are done. But the button or the strap here is actually removable. I can pull that off. I can put it on if I don't want it. If I don't want it there, I can take it off, stick the knife in the sheath. Because this has got such a positive engagement, that strap really isn't necessary. But to make it jump rated, to make it, you know, just give you that extra little bit of added security, make it mil spec if you want to go in that direction, that does need that little snap. And this one here, again, it needs it. It definitely needs that little snap because I don't quite trust the retention on this sheath. I mean, just because of that, it's just like a subconscious play that this sheath messes with my brain, and the fact that it doesn't have a positive engagement, I don't quite trust it. But when in reality, I know that the retention on the sheath is good enough. You know, I know that it's not going to go anywhere, but this little rubber strap right here is kind of necessary. However, it's not removable. It is bolted onto the back of the sheath, which again, if you look at how far that thing protrudes off, there's a button there. You know what I mean? There's a button. There's a lot of space to actually get that thing to fit in there. And with as thin as and as slender of a knife design as this is, having a big button sticking off there may actually protrude further off the knife than the pocket clip, which wouldn't be good because then it's going to be digging into your side and stuff like that. Nobody wants that. It's not necessarily a good thing. So it is good that it's permanently mounted on there. I just wish that they'd have figured out a better way to actually mount that thing on. It's good for left or right-handed carry if you want to hook it up to the other side so you can actually use whatever thumb you want to actually deploy the blade itself. It's not so tight on there that it's not movable. And I definitely like the fact that it's rubber. It's got that little reinforced rubber. You can actually see the material, whatever's in there, kind of cloth material, whatever's actually inside this rubber strap. Give it a little bit of extra support. I definitely like that, but you got to get it out of the way when you're actually putting this knife in there because you'll cut it real quick. And I do like the fact of just the amount of retention it has. It's not going to go anywhere. It's definitely secure. So the sheath is done pretty well. I'm definitely a fan of that. It's not the biggest knife in the world. It kind of looks a little bit small, you know, in my hand. But in reality, I mean, the blade length on this thing, what is it? Yeah, it's got a 4.52 inch blade length. So it's 4.5 inch blade length, which is larger than this is a... What is this? This is a Spyderco Endura. It's a Damascus version, but you get the general idea on the actual size. And the same thing with this Benchmade Reptilian here. So it is a long blade. It is definitely a working blade. It's going to do the job that it needs to get done, but it's still very light. It's very maneuverable in my hand. I like what Benchmade's been coming out with. I think they've been doing pretty good and actually coming out this year. Give you another size comparison here. This is a Benchmade SOCP dagger. It's a 178 single edge drop point model of the SOCP dagger. And actually get this damn thing out of the sheath. That's the new 15200 altitude from Benchmade. Giving that little size comparison. Look at how thin this freaking knife is. It's ridiculous. I definitely like it though. I've been carrying that thing in my boot the last couple days. So this is it's a cool knife. You know, I'm definitely a fan of it. I am a big fan that I got number 2 out of 700. This thing is probably just going to be mounted on my wall. I'm going to take it down and stab boxes and crap like that with it. I have been stabbing pizza boxes basically since I got it. Used to see some of the pizza boxes in my house are just destroyed from this freaking thing. Looks like Armageddon's come through here for cardboard. I haven't done any cut tests with it because it's D2 from Benchmade. I relatively know what that's going to do. I definitely am a fan of this thing. I'm going to be picking up the 417 Fact next. This thing kind of screwed me on that, but at the same time, how could you turn down number 2 out of 700? I can't get over that. It's number freaking 2. Ha. That is just cool stuff. Yeah. That's it. Y'all have a good one.